Okay, we're gonna go live in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
I don't see it live streaming yet, Whitney.
Okay, I've got live stream at the top of my screen.
There we go. Yep, I see it now.
Perfect.
All right, welcome back to the Climate and Fisheries stream of Wisconsin Water Week. This is Paul Skowinski with Extension Lakes. I'll be moderating the session today. Thanks to Wisconsin Lake and Pond Resource for sponsoring this morning's Climate and Fisheries session. Please remember to post your questions into the Q&A window within the conference platform, Event Mobi, not the chat box. To the right of the presentation screen that you are watching right now, you should see a window with chat, polls, and Q&A tabs at the top. You can use that Q&A tab to ask your own question or add your vote to a question that has already been asked. Our speakers today are Greg Sass and Zach Feiner. Greg earned his MS and PhD in zoology from UW-Madison Center for Limnology. Greg was previously the director of the Illinois River Biological Station with the Illinois Natural History Survey and is currently the fisheries research team leader with the Wisconsin DNR. Greg's talk is titled Phenological Whiplash and Fisheries, and Zach will be assisting him as well. Zach is a research scientist with Wisconsin DNR and UW Center for Limnology. He focuses on fisheries research topics on inland lakes, including walleye, panfish, and climate change issues. Go ahead, and Greg, take it away.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you all for attending this morning's session here in this virtual conference. Today I'll be talking about phenological whiplash in fisheries, and don't worry if phenological or whiplash doesn't make any sense right now. I think as we go through the talk today, it'll become clear as we define those terms and discuss what that all means for lake ecosystems and fisheries. At this time, I'd like to acknowledge Zach and I's co-authors here. Hillary Dugan is one of the leaders on this particular project. Hillary is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Center for Limnology, and also Noah Loddig and Gretchen Garish, who are University of Wisconsin Center for Limnology employees based at the Trout Lake Station in Boulder Junction, Wisconsin, in Vilas County. Oops. To begin with a little background on climate change, I think many of us interested in this subject are familiar with these sorts of graphs. So the lower left here, I have carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere as observed at Mauna Loa. And on the right, what this might mean for average temperatures. So on the left panel, if we look from 1960 to present, we've seen this exponential increase in carbon dioxide from this monitoring station. And likewise, in the right panel, when we look at what these carbon dioxide concentrations mean for average temperatures based on several models using a baseline from 1951 to 1980, we can see that these projections and what it means for overall climate on average is an increase in air temperature by about 1 degree Celsius over the past 40 years or so. When we think about climate change in lakes, what this means, or the things that we're dealing with or going to be talking about today, are things like overall lake warming, definitely the influences of greater precipitation and extreme weather events influencing our lake ecosystems, and then also later ice on and earlier ice off dates, which is going to be the primary focus of Zach and I's talk today. So we think about climate change then in lake ice dynamics, which I said is going to be the primary focus of the talk today. We don't need to pay a tremendous amount of attention to the graph here on the left. This was published by John Magnuson and his co-authors in Science in 2000, looking at average lake and river ice out and ice on dates. And the bottom line from this very long-term record that John and his colleagues were able to compile is that average lake and river ice on dates have been later over time on average. Likewise, average lake and river ice off dates have been earlier over time. And so although these trends are very important and ones that we should be tracking, what Zach and I are going to discuss today are the implications of variability. So although these average trends are important, is the variability in the trends more important for lake ecosystem dynamics and their responses? To show a great example of this, given a long-term 75-year record from Escanaba Lake, which is based in Vilas County, these are ice on and ice off dates, a running average over that 75-year period. And what we can see in these figures is that on the left panel, the ice on dates have been later over time, later in the season, and more variable, and that our ice off dates have also been more variable, although that mean has not changed over time. And so if we focus on both of these red boxes over the past 20 years, for ice on, we can see that, again, it's been later into the season, pushing up against the new year into mid to late December, but also that variability. And we can see how much it's swung variability wise in the past 10 years or so, such that ice on dates have swung from mid-November all the way almost to New Year's Day. Likewise, looking at ice off, we've also seen this very high variability over the past 20 years in our ice off dates, such that we've had ice off dates that have ranged from mid-March all the way until mid-May. And this variability seems to be increasing over time, along with these overall average trends in warming due to climate change. So here's where phenological whiplash comes into play, and what we'll discuss today in the context of lake limnological conditions, phytoplankton and zooplankton, and then on to fish, which will be the primary focus of Zach's part of the talk today. So when referring to phenology, we're talking about the timing of recurring biological events, the causes of their timing regarding biotic and abiotic forces, and the interrelation among phases of the same or different species. And so we've coined this as a research group as phenological whiplash, where we're really interested in thinking back to the previous slide, what this interannual phenological variability means for lake ecosystems and their food webs, again, in the context of limnology, the physical attributes of lakes, but then also to the food web dynamics when it comes to phytoplankton and zooplankton blooms, which can also then influence fish recruitment and survival. And so from Escanaba Lake, pictured here in this area, really some of those extreme events can be characterized really well over the past 7 years or so. So for ice on in Escanaba Lake in 2015, we're at December 28th. And then just 4 years later, we had a major swing, even though this isn't back-to-back or consecutive years, but here we have an ice on date of November 13th, 2019. So 45-day difference over that 4-year period in ice on date. For ice off, one of our most extreme events that's happened most recently was between 2012 and 2013. So in 2012, we had an ice out of March 22nd. And then in 2013, just a year later, we had an ice off of May 9th. And so there was a 47-degree swing between 1 year and ice off dates. So what does these sort of phenological whiplash events mean for the limnological conditions of lakes? And there's 3 panels here, and just to orientate you, the one on the left is related to hyperlimnetic temperature. So this is our lower cold water layer in stratified lakes. The middle panel being thermocline depth, so where that transition occurs from the epilimnion in those warmer epilimnetic waters in the hyperlimnion. And then on the right, our hyperlimnetic oxygen saturation. And in these colors, red here denotes our early ice off years, and in blue, these are our late ice off years. And so going through each of these panels, in our early ice off years, we tend to have greater hyperlimnetic temperatures in that cold water layer compared to years where ice off is late. Likewise, with our thermocline depth, we tend to see a deeper thermocline in the early ice off years and one that's shallower in our later ice off years. And as far as hyperlimnetic oxygen saturation, in our early ice off years, we tend to have greater oxygen saturation in the hyperlimnion, at least starting out earlier in the season compared to our later ice off years. So definitely some differences in limnological dynamics based on our ice off dates in earlier, later years. And this also then carries over to phenological whiplash and plankton. And so again, with the 3 panels here, color-coded basically the same except for the gray panel. On the left, we have our phytoplankton abundance, our rotifer abundance in the middle, and our cladoceran abundance on the right. So for phytoplankton, in our early ice-off years, we see that that peak is earlier. In our later ice-off years, that peak is later and average is right in between. For rotifer abundance, we definitely see some differences in the timing and the magnitude of this key zooplankton species. And so in our early ice-off years, we tend to get a peak right away after ice goes out. In our late ice-off years, we see that the magnitude of rotifer abundance remains really low and is kind of prolonged, and then average in gray is somewhere in between. And then likewise with cladocerans, which are tightly linked, or their abundance is tightly linked to phytoplankton, we see in the early ice-off years a peak that's kind of lagged after the phytoplankton bloom. For our late ice-off years, we see this is pushed significantly farther and later into the season, and the magnitude in abundance of cladocerans is also lower. And then when we have average, we're again in the middle and following the timing of that peak phytoplankton bloom, but we also see the magnitude of our cladoceran abundances being higher. So these phenological whiplash events, they alter the timing and the magnitude of phytoplankton and zooplankton blooms. If we carry this forward then to the next kind of level of organization in the food web, we need to talk about trophic mismatch. In here, trophic mismatch is the lack of synchrony between the phenology of consumers and that of their resources that can lead to a phenomenon called trophic mismatch, which may have important consequences on the reproductive success of herbivores and the growth of consumers. And so looking at this graph, which depicts the trophic mismatch very well, on our y-axis, we have abundance, and on our x-axis, we have time. And so when we have a consumer like fish larvae shown here in the left-hand distribution, in an ideal situation where our consumer or fish larvae survivorship and recruitment is going to be highest is when their need for the resources or the resource best overlaps with that of the zooplankton they need. And so that would be depicted here in the light gray. So we have high overlap between an abundant zooplankton resource and when those fish consumers need it. Likewise, a mismatch occurs when there's very little overlap between those distributions, such that if our zooplankton resource peaks later in time, we see very little overlap when those fish need those resources, and that would be depicted in the shading in dark gray here, which can then potentially have consequences on the growth and recruitment and the first year survival of those fish larvae that need those resources at critical times. So to play and look at a little schematic of what this looks like based on ice-off dynamics being average, early, and late. In our average ice-off years, which we consider optimal timing here, we see in the yellow, we have our spring phytoplankton bloom, which is then followed up by a bump up in our rotifers and our big Daphnia bloom. And you can see we have good overlap here then between our fish consumers needing this resource, which can lead to high survival, recruitment, and then also growth of those young year and larval fishes. When we have early ice-off years, we see that the phytoplankton bloom earlier, shown by the arrow here. We see that the rotifers then peak closely in abundance after that bloom, but we see this lag in the Daphnia in our cladocerans, and also the magnitude of that peak being lower, such that there's the potential for a mismatch here that would influence those fish consumers. Likewise, a very similar scenario in our late ice-off situation, where now, again, with that arrow depicting the timing, our phytoplankton bloom is going to be delayed. We see negative consequences as a result on the timing and the abundance of our rotifers and our cladocerans, and likewise a mismatch again, potentially with our young year fishes and their need for those resources in order to grow and to survive. So to put this in the context of the species that we're dealing with then, so this is moving on to our consumers now that need those zooplankton resources or could be influenced by phenological whiplash. I'm going to separate this into two types of species that we have in Wisconsin. And first I'll talk about our fall spawning fish. And so here I'm talking about species in our inland lakes, such as Cisco, lake trout, and lake whitefish. These are cold water species that are native to some of our inland lakes in Wisconsin. And interestingly, with these species, is their spawning is cued to photoperiod in fall. And so I've got this as kind of the heavy hitting take home message here in yellow on the right. But when it comes to phenological whiplash, photoperiod in this case has not changed. It's going to stay the same. But ice on and ice off variability has, which could have influences on these species. And so these three species are cued to spawn in the fall based on photoperiod. And so that's regardless of ice on dates in this case. Those eggs then are going to hatch in spring, so they overwinter after a certain number of growing degree days under the ice. And we can envision as the winter limnology or variability in ice on and ice off dates is occurring, that this may also influence the hatching of those young of year fish from these fall spawners, and likewise influence their recruitment and survival. And so this variability in ice off and ice on dates may influence these species potentially in different ways from what I'll talk about next in our fall spawn, in our spring spawning fishes. So for our spring spawning fishes, just examples here, we have many fishes that spawn in the spring in Wisconsin, but I'll focus on walleye and yellow perch. Now we have these two species being spring broadcast spawners, and by that I mean that they don't offer any parental care like a bluegill or a black crappie or a largemouth bass or smallmouth bass would, but they're simply scattering their eggs after they're fertilized onto cobble substrates in the case of walleye, and then onto aquatic vegetation or coarse woody habitat with yellow perch. But now for these species, their spawning is triggered by water temperature. And so again, the variability in ice off dates may influence recruitment and sustainability through those trophic mismatches that we just outlined through those schematics and with the data from the physical limnological conditions that can occur because of this variability. So in this case, the ice off variability influences spring water temperatures for these species with implications about their growth, survival, and recruitment. To wrap up, before I pass it off to Zach, I don't think we need to focus heavily on what all these figures mean, but basically as a group, we're reviewing and viewing this research in the context of what we call panarchy theory in ecology and these adaptive cycles. And these adaptive cycles in these infinity symbols here are basically representing a lake in a year in northern Wisconsin, where we do have ice off and ice on. And essentially what we're looking at in this research is if ice on is kind of the start of a stabilization event, and ice off is basically one of the challenges that lakes are facing because of this variability. As we move through this annual adaptive cycle of ice on to ice off to then the dynamics that occur in spring and into summer and then back to fall, there's many places along this adaptive cycle, particularly in the springtime where these phenological whiplash events are occurring, but also in the fall when the variability in ice on is occurring, where these adaptive cycles may change and have some negative implications for our lake ecosystems. And with that, I'll thank everyone for joining my portion of the talk today, and I'm going to pass this off to Zach Feiner to finish up, as he's going to talk more about these phenological whiplash scenarios and what this means for fish spawning and also their phenology.
All right, thanks, Greg. I'm gonna get my talk up here. Okay, yeah, so thanks, Greg, for the great introduction. We covered a lot of really good material. I'm gonna focus in on whiplash and walleye. So trying to understand, as Greg mentioned, what the effects of these types of phenological variances are on walleye, particularly looking at their recruitment. And I just wanted to quickly point out a number of people and agencies that have helped me with these data. I'm going to show data from Escanaba Lake as well as a whole bunch of lakes across northern Wisconsin. So just wanted to quickly thank the DNR and CFL, and also GLFWC, the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, for helping me with these data. This is a very large ongoing project. So to really briefly touch on why walleye, I think as Wisconsinites, a lot of us are probably very familiar with walleye, whether we've been out fishing for them or just seen them on a menu of a fish fry somewhere in the state. But walleye are one of the major fisheries that we have in Wisconsin. So this is a cover of our fishing regulations from a couple of years ago, where they're probably one of the most sought after game fish by recreational anglers in the state. And in addition, they provide a very culturally important spear fishing or subsistence fishery for tribal peoples in the northern part of the state. So we have this extremely important resource that walleye are representing. So changes in that resource are very concerning for a number of different stakeholder groups. And that's actually what we're seeing over time with walleye. So we are having some problems with our walleye fisheries in Wisconsin, as people may have seen in different news reports or from reading different papers. And in general, what we're seeing is that walleye catches are going down. So this is showing the proportion of the harvest of different species in a recreational fishery over time. And I just want to make you focus on the light purple, which is walleye. And you can see generally, as proportion of harvest, we're seeing fewer walleye harvested in the state. At the same time, we're seeing a reduction in recruitment. So we index recruitment as the number of age 0 fish that we catch in the fall in our fall electrofishing surveys. So these are fish that were born in the spring, survived through the summer to get sampled in the fall. And what we see is if you just kind of look at average age 0 abundance across lakes over time is a pretty marked declining trend. And in response, what we've actually done is started to stock more walleye. So we're seeing a smaller proportion of our lakes supported by natural recruitment, which is this light color here. And more of our lakes are requiring to have either some stocking, which is this gray, or be totally stocked, which is this black color. So we're seeing these declines and we're trying to mitigate them through stocking. But the real question is what's driving these declines, and climate change is one of these potential issues, and the phenology angle is something we've just started to tap into in terms of what impacts climate change is going to have on walleye moving forward. So just to talk a little bit about walleye spawning ecology and kind of what triggers them and what drives their recruitment, because it can be important for thinking about kind of the implications of phenology down the line. Walleye, as Greg pointed out, spawn in the spring, where they come up into these shallow areas and deposit their eggs. And then these eggs will hatch into little larvae that swim around and eat zooplankton and hopefully survive and grow and become our age 0s here in the fall. And as I pointed out, there are lots of different environmental factors that determine success at each of these stages. So walleye spawning is triggered by things like ice off, temperature, photo period. Egg survival requires oxygen and good temperatures for egg development, as well as predators can also eat walleye eggs. Same thing for larval fish. They need optimal temperatures. They need to have food around, which is really important, which we'll talk about later. And again, predation. And then survival to this offspring stage, and then over winter, again, temperature, food, their ability to grow and to kind of accrue resources during the summertime so they can survive a low energy availability winter is really important. And so you can imagine the timing of all these different things becomes vital for determining the ability of these larvae and juveniles to survive. So if we're thinking about if walleye are spawning kind of in match or mismatch, as Greg talked about before, with different, for example, zooplankton resources, that can have really big impacts on the ability of these larvae to survive to the juvenile stage, and for these juveniles to be big enough to then survive over winter. So you can immediately see the really important component that phenology can play in determining walleye recruitment down the line. So I'm going to show you some data from a case study first. And the case study I'm going to talk about is Escanaba Lake, which Greg mentioned a little bit earlier. It's a lake up in Vilas County. It's probably one of the best studied lakes. It's certainly the best studied lake in Wisconsin, probably one of the better studied lakes in the country. And that is because we have a really nice setup where we have the DNR research station right on the lake. And every year they go out and they put out fyke nets and catch these adult walleye. Here's Greg holding a nice adult walleye from their fyke netting surveys. So we get a sense of, from those fyke netting surveys, of when spawning is happening and how many fish are out there. And in the fall, we'll go out and electrofish and we'll catch these age 0 and 1 walleye, these juveniles. And that gives us our indicator, as I mentioned, of recruitment and how successful those offspring are at surviving to the fall and potentially then setting them up to survive over winter. And what we can see is that walleye spawning phenology is changing in a couple different ways. So just kind of orient you to this graph. This is the day of year that walleye sampling has occurred. So over here is earlier. April 1st is about day 90. May 1st is about 120. Over here is later. And this is going from past to present. So each of these horizontal lines is a year. And these distributions are showing the total catches of female walleye from those spike net surveys that I mentioned. You can get a sense from the height and the width of those distributions about what the kind of catch distribution look like in that year, and kind of from the way those distributions change over time, you can get a sense of how phenology is changing. And right away, I think a couple of really interesting things pop out. So the first one is that, as the yellow line shows, yeah, there has been some change in walleye phenology in Escanaba Lake over time. So this is going from about 1947 to present day. Almost every year is covered here. And they are starting to slide a little earlier. But what really jumps out to me is how much more variation we have in recent years. So you can see this kind of bell-shaped curve going upward, where you have a lot of variation going from 2012, where they're spawning in late March, actually, all the way to 2013, 2014, where they're not spawning till the middle of May. 50 day of variation in spawning day in consecutive years. And this kind of extreme variation is what we're really interested in trying to understand the implications of that variation for recruitment. So just kind of put numbers on it in a more quantitative way. We also do things like we know when ice off has occurred in Escanaba Lake over time. They also take water temperatures almost every day. And what we find is that there hasn't been much linear change or change in the average in either of these metrics over time. So spring water temperature on May 1st, hasn't actually changed very much in a linear direction. Neither has ice off date over time. But what really jumps out is how much more variable from year to year these metrics have become. So again, these are the same lines. Now this is a rolling standard deviation. So it's just asking, in the past 10 years from each date, how much variation has there been, more or less. And what we find is that, especially in the recent years, so this bump in the 90s and this really big increase leading up to present day, we have this massive increase in variation from year to year in ice off date and water temperature. And because, as I mentioned, walleye spawning is triggered by things like ice off and temperature and light, we have found that while walleye spawning has trended slightly earlier, as Greg has mentioned, what we've seen more dramatically is this huge increase in interannual variation from year to year. So you're seeing these giant jumps up and down, and that's reflected in this really high standard deviation in spawning date in recent years. So when we had wanted to ask then, well, what does this mean for walleye recruitment? We looked at the relationship between age 0 walleye abundance, which is on the Y here, and then the days from the average spawning date for each year. In other words, how big of a kind of a mismatch, or how big of a miss from the overall average was spawning in that particular year. So for example, these would be very big misses, and this dot here would be a very small one. It's very close to the average. And what we found is a fairly striking negative relationship between mismatch, more or less, and recruitment. So in other words, very extreme years, which again, the days from mean more stronger colors, or also mean a bigger mismatch. Very extreme years, you get very low recruitment. And you can only get these really great recruitment years when you're pretty close to the average. So it seems like this mismatch theory could be coming into play, where walleye need to kind of spawn about on an average time when they expect conditions to be good. And if you have a very extreme year with very unpredictable conditions, that's actually bad for recruitment. But that's only one lake. So the next question is, well, what about other lakes? We have all this great data, but it's really only from one lake, Escanaba. So we started to look around and think about other ways we could index walleye spawn timing from data that we have on hand, because we wanted to build a time series from a bunch of different lakes to look and see if these trends are similar across the landscape. Because again, we're seeing walleye decline in a lot of places, not just a few places. So if we are able to look across the landscape, maybe we can get a better idea of these broad scale patterns. And one place we landed was actually using catch data from these tribal spearing fisheries. So as I mentioned before, the tribes have the right to go out and participate in this traditional fishery in the springtime. And what they do is they go out at night in the spring when walleye are up shallow to spawn, because that makes them more vulnerable to spearing. And then they actually report their daily catch as well. So we can actually look at days with very high catches of fish and kind of assume that those are the days that there were lots of walleye on the spawning grounds, which means that's a pretty good approximation of when peak walleye spawning was happening that year. And this is just a big grid showing how much data we have from these fisheries. And this is a really great resource for understanding walleye ecology, where again, we have the day of year and we have the total catch, and these lines are just showing how many times each of these lakes, each of these little boxes is a lake, have gotten visited over the years. We have lots and lots of really great time series data from this fishery to think about things like phenology. And this is again just showing you a couple different lakes, and now each of these boxes is a year. And unfortunately, I cut off the names of these lakes, but this is just to show that if you look at the dots, which are the daily walleye catches, if you have lakes that get visited a lot, you can actually pretty well closely approximate when peak spawning is happening. You have some of these dates that have lots of walleye caught and some dates that don't have very many walleye caught. So you can get a nice dome here and think about this is probably when peak spawning is happening in these lakes. And again, this is just a couple of lakes, and we have a ton of lakes that have 30 or 40 years of data where we can start to think about long-term changes in walleye phenology based on a really valuable data set like this one. So what do we see if we take these data and look across different lakes over time? Well, the first one is we just look at directional change over time. So this is the date of max female catch, or max walleye catch, excuse me, over a year. Again, now each of these boxes is a different lake. And what you might notice is that a lot of these regression lines are pretty flat. There isn't much directional change in walleye phenology over time across a lot of these lakes. Another way to show this is to look at the distribution of the slopes of those lines, which is what this is showing you. And the peak of this slope is really close to zero. So this is basically saying, yeah, most of these lakes are kind of floating around zero slope. There isn't much change occurring. And you do have tails on either side where some lakes are changing a little bit more rapidly than others. But the general punchline is that there hasn't been much directional change, which is similar to what we see in Escanaba. What we do see, however, is an increase in spawning date variability over time. So this is that difference from the mean variable again, just like I showed you against Escanaba recruitment a few slides ago. And you'll notice every single one of these lines is going up, right? We're seeing a bigger overall average difference from the mean in more recent years. And again, if we look at the distribution of those slopes, here's zero, and the peak is way over here in the positive range. So almost all of the lakes that we look at are increasing in variability over time. So what does that mean for recruitment? Well, if we just look across all of the lakes in all of the years where we have recruitment data, and again, look at the deviation from average spawning time against recruitment, this should look really familiar to the Escanaba graph, right? So there are very few lakes that have lots of recruits when you have an extreme year, and you only get these big peak years when you're kind of pretty close to the average within 10 days or so. So this is just all of the data plotted. To make it a little easier to see, I'm just going to put some regression lines, and each of these lines is now for a different lake, and they're color-coded by the size of the slope. So darker colors are steeper negative slopes, you can kind of see here. And this dark black line is the average slope. And what you'll notice again, so across all data sets, it looks like a negative slope. And even if you look at within individual lakes, you have lots of negative slopes, mostly negative slopes, in fact. This is again looking to us like extreme years are bad for walleye recruitment. And if we look at the distribution of those slopes, as I showed before, here is zero, and it is a little bit to the left over here in the negative territory. And you look at this tail, and that's a much more negative, many more negative slopes than you have over here in the positive side. So this looks like there is a pretty substantial evidence for a negative relationship between extreme phenology events and recruitment, where if you are really, are in an extreme year and you have a big mismatch, that's bad for the survival of those offspring. So this is all kind of observational data so far. And the next place we wanted to look is, well, let's actually look at mismatch and look at fish growth in different types of years and see whether we see any effects. So this is the next place we looked, and we looked in it for yellow perch and for walleye. And yellow perch are actually from a couple other lakes in northern Wisconsin. Walleye is from Escanaba. And what we found is actually kind of interesting because those species didn't do the exact same thing. So this is fish length. And again, these are just showing kind of the distributions of fish length in a few different years. So we have some very late years, which are blue. Average years are in gray. And then these early years, very warm years, were in red in each graph. And what we found is that I think maybe more matching our hypothesis, yellow perch in late years where spawning occurred late, you can think maybe there's less time to grow. Those fish were smaller in the fall. And the average years are kind of in the middle. And very early years, you can again think warm, more time to grow, you get larger fish, which I think kind of makes intuitive sense. What was interesting was when we looked at walleye, it didn't shake out like that. We actually saw the biggest fish in the average years. And then both early and late years were a little bit below average in terms of walleye growth. So there are a couple of reasons for this. Walleye have the switch to piscivory, they're predators, right? So they need to have kind of fish prey around. And it could be that in average years, those prey are better timed up for walleye to switch to eating fish, and that can really give them a great bump in growth. Compared to perch that kind of stick to eating zooplankton and bugs. But it's this really interesting line of evidence that suggests that different species might even be reacting to phenological whiplash in different ways. But again, this is concerning that walleye growth is below average in either kind of extreme event if we think those types of extreme phenology events are going to occur more often. Okay, so what this kind of screams out to me and what we really need to start looking at in the future and what we're planning on looking at is that this is evidence for this match mismatch. So again, Greg talked about this before, where you have different types of production of different types of prey in different years at different times and different abundances, and that affects fish growth. So again, perhaps in early and late years, the lineup of when larvae are produced and when those zooplankton are available and when fish prey are available isn't ideal, and that leads to poor growth. And poor growth usually leads to poor recruitment, because if a fish is not getting enough to eat, it might starve, it might become more susceptible to extreme weather events, and especially overwinter survival can be really compromised if fish aren't big enough and don't have enough kind of fat reserves to make it through a winter that's usually fairly low in food. So we have this really interesting line of evidence for the impacts of phenology going all the way through to walleye recruitment. So just to kind of wrap up some big ideas here, what we have shown, I think, is that ice phenology is changing, and especially it's becoming more variable, if you remember Greg showing this slide before. Second, that those changes in phenology feed through to influences on things like winter limnology and the availability of food. And these different phenological responses by things like plankton and fish can lead to these types of trophic mismatches that lead to food not being around when these little fish or little zooplankton need to have it to survive. And then that could potentially fill all the way through to actually seeing changes in population abundance over time. So you can imagine if recruitment is poor in extreme years and we get more and more extreme years going forward, we get more missed recruitment years, and that could potentially drive or be one of the causes behind decreasing abundance of walleye, for example, across the state over time in response to this climate change effect. So there are lots of things that we need to be thinking about. And as Greg, I just want to pull this up because this is a really cool figure, that we're thinking about phenological whiplash as this kind of integrated whole ecosystem disturbance. It's in this climate effect is influencing how different aspects of lake communities interact, fish and zooplankton and algae. That influences the growth and survival of different of individuals. And that ultimately can influence the kind of evolution and development of these types of interactions and of different life history traits in these fish, and overall influence kind of how the entire ecosystem is actually working together to produce different ecosystem services. And this is something that we're working on with a group of us here at the CFL and the DNR. Hillary Dugan, Gretchen Garish, and Noah Lodig at the CFL have been really instrumental in thinking about these ideas and putting together a big proposal package to actually go out and try and measure some of these variables more quantitatively and actually get at the mechanisms underlying how different aspects of the ecosystem work and respond to phenology. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for their attention. Again, thank my co-author and co-presenter, Greg, and the invitation also to present here. And we're happy to stick around and answer any questions that folks have. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Greg and Zach. We have Q&A until 10:45 here, so remember to use the Q&A tab to enter your questions for Greg and Zach. We do have 3 questions that have come in so far. First one is fall spawning strictly due to photoperiod? I've seen papers pointing to temperatures, strong wind events, lake mixing. Might fall spawning dates be shifting as well, or do they seem to be fixed in Wisconsin lakes?
So that's a great question. I think just as Zach talked about with walleye and perch spawning, where it's more dominated by water temperature, but there is a photo period context. I think for our fall spawning fishes, at least to my knowledge, that it would likewise be that photo period is maybe a stronger driver than water temperature, but there's likely some water temperature effects as well. So I need to do a little bit more work on that one. Some anecdotal records too I need to check into from our local fish biologist here, Steve Gilbert, or former fish biologist here in Vilas County, Steve Gilbert, who's now a team supervisor. He's got some really good records from Trout Lake with whitefish and stuff like that. And so I think there is the potential for, because of these photoperiod cues, that these species are still spawning around a typical photo period with a little bit of variability in water temperature, such that there could be some changes there. But likewise, as I mentioned in the talk, I think one of the important things is that, those eggs hatch after a certain amount of growing degree days under ice. And so those winter limnological conditions and phenological mismatches could be really important for setting the stage for longer term sustainability, such that if we have warm winter limnological conditions, that those eggs might hatch into an environment with little or no food and early. And likewise, if it's colder winter limnology, maybe they hatch at a time when those resources are available and survive. And so this is work in progress, like Zach mentioned, and we're developing proposals for it. And I hope I address that question at least somewhat adequately. But there's a lot of nuances to all this stuff, and it makes it very interesting, especially to think about our fall spawning fishes as well.
Thanks, Greg. Next question is, have you compared walleye recruitment in lakes with more development versus undeveloped shorelines? Likely a different chemical makeup in the water due to lawns, lawn chemicals, septic effluent, and medications or hormones.
Zach, do you want to go over?
So
I can chime in too.
That's something that we've tried to address in these kind of large scale projects, but I think Greg might be a better situation to talk about on one of the walleye projects we have, where that is one of the variables that they're focusing on in terms of habitat for walleye and the effects of recruitment and differences among different lakes.
Yeah, so what the project that Zach's referring to is actually led by Dr. Stephanie Shaw. She's a research scientist with Wisconsin DNR, and we just call it our Walleye Comparative Recruitment Project. But the goal of the project is to look more closely and at finer detail in lakes that have had long-term stable walleye recruitment versus those that used to have natural recruitment and have failed or had some challenges over time. And so our overall question is to go into these lakes and again look at things like limnological conditions, zooplankton, the fish community, shoreline development, littoral habitat, and is there any pattern or difference between the lakes where we've maintained good natural recruitment over time versus those where it has declined. And I can only say that the results are preliminary right now. We're aiming to get to 50 or 60 lakes, about half and half of good recruitment and those that have declined. But from Stephanie's preliminary work, lakes that tend to have had some challenges in their natural recruitment over time tend to be the lakes that are more developed, have more shoreline development. And I know there were a number of other factors listed in the question there. Some of those we're not necessarily addressing directly, but you could imagine that lakeshore residential development could have a part in some of those variables.
All right, the next question is about trout perch. Is this species a good food for walleye?
I guess I'd have to consult Becker 1983. I mean, there's been a lot of walleye diet studies out there. My guess is that walleye are a pretty generalist species. And so if trout perch were present and available, I don't think walleye would turn them down.
Yeah, I think that would be my answer. You think of walleye eating fish, and it's really a lot of times kind of about uh, the overlap of different prey species with where walleye are hanging out and the size of those fish. So if it's the right size, they will absolutely try and eat it. So trout perch is definitely on the menu. It may be then more a function of their abundance relative to where the walleye are in terms of how important they are as a diet item in a particular lake.
Yeah, I think walleye are an interesting species, Zach, and for those out there in the audience, and the fact that we like to classify them as piscivores and that they only eat fish. When we look at their diet contents are actually quite generalist. You'll find crayfish in their diets. You'll find a number of different invertebrate species depending upon their abundance. For those of us that fish for walleyes, you know, the bite can be pretty tough if there's a big mayfly hatch when walleye are really keying on and taking advantage of that resource. Same thing when crayfish are molting. You'll find a lot of soft shell crayfish in walleye diets. And so thinking about the diet studies that I've reviewed, they'll eat a number of different fish species, and I would imagine the trout perch would be on that list as well.
Great. We have one more question. I'll just remind everybody to, we still have 14 minutes for Q&A, so use the Q&A tab within the EventMobi platform to post additional questions in here. The last question we have is for Zach. Are the spearing data from a variety of stocked versus natural recruitment and mixed lakes, are there any differences in the distributions of the shifts in spawning dates among those groups?
That is a really great question. To the first answer, yes, there are different levels of stocking across the state. So this is very preliminary data that I just got my hands on a little while ago. And that is an excellent question that I have not investigated yet. We do see differences in recruitment dynamics across lakes that have different levels of stocking, or I guess require different levels of stocking. It's kind of a chicken or the egg thing, right? If the recruitment is going down, that leads to increased probability that lake is stocked. So there is a correlation there. But we do think we see differences in how recruitment works in lakes that have needed stocking versus lakes that haven't, kind of what like Greg was talking about with the walleye recruitment or comparative recruitment project. And I think that is an excellent question, and one that I am currently working on is, yes, comparing phenology and the impacts of phenology on lakes that have different recruitment dynamics and different recruitment processes, and thinking about whether that changes their resilience to other stressors too. So presence of warm water species, fishing, other things like that, because it's all kind of interrelated, and figuring out those interrelationships can really help us understand how to better manage the species too.
Okay. Let's see. There's a question about trout perch. Could you talk about that particular species? The person is wondering, is that two species or some kind of hybrid? But it's actually a real kind of fish. So can you guys talk about what that is?
I have to dig into my ichthyology here. Trout perch is an individual species. Let's see, Zach, back me up on this. It's in the percid family, so it's in the same family of fishes as yellow perch and walleye and sauger.
And darters too. It's kind of
Darters,
in the darter
yep.
complex. Yeah.
Yep. And so it's almost more of a darter really than like a sauger walleye or a yellow perch. What else was with that question?
The person was just, I don't think had ever heard of that species before. So they thought, is this a trout perch hybrid that we're talking about here, or what's going on here? So.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's a species where the common name is just trout perch for whatever reason, but it's in that kind of complex of smallish darters and other perchid species, and it can be quite abundant in some places. It's kind of a benthivorous little fish, and it likes to hang out in kind of clear to slightly turbid water. And I guess it's one that we don't know a ton about because it's one of these kind of small, it's a non-game fish. But it's a very interesting species in terms of kind of what it does and where it lives. So yeah, I encourage them to check out more about it.
I think I can still remember the scientific name. I think it's Persina caprotes, I think. I'll have to go check that. I can't guarantee it, but I have to dig back to my Ecology of Fishes lab as a TA at graduate school and just other ichthyology background.
Can you talk about the age of a walleye at spawning, at sexual maturity, and when people catch a legal size walleye, like around here in the Wisconsin River, it's a 15 to 20 inch walleye. What age of fish are they looking for there?
It's a great question, and it's one that we get pretty often. It really, growth varies greatly among individual lakes, and so our inland walleye waters, they all vary in their lake productivities and also to an extent in their growth rates. If I had to, play averages given all the ceded territory walleye data, and Zach, you can back me up on this too, that typically that 15-inch minimum size limit is around when fish are maturing. So for males, I would just say on average that they're going to mature between ages 3 and 5. And then the females mature about a year or two later. And so for females, it could be, 4 to 6, 4 to 7, somewhere in there in that range.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so particularly for males, that 15-inch fish is almost always mature. So one of the things that we see is, as Greg mentioned, males will mature smaller and younger than females. So that 15-inch male is mature. A 15-inch female is probably getting pretty close, but may or may not be, depending on kind of growth rates of the lake and life history of that particular population. So yeah, I think that's kind of the origin of those kind of 15 to 18-inch length limits, and thinking about how to kind of protect fish and allow them maybe to spawn before they're susceptible to harvest. But it's in that range where they start to become mature.
Maybe just for those that are listening in here, we often think about maturity as like age or length at 50% maturity. And so, the kind of averages that Zach and I just gave here, you can imagine that there's going to be half of that distribution that might be maturing a little bit earlier than the back half of that distribution, if we think about it as age or length at 50% maturity. So it definitely is a distribution, and that distribution can occur within a lake and then certainly among lakes as well, and be slightly different.
You guys talked about spearing in the shallows in lakes as the walleyes move into shallow areas in the springtime. Do they do the same behavior in river systems in the spring?
Yeah, they do. So a lot of times in river systems, at least in my experience, and Greg can talk about this too, they'll run up to find kind of shallower, kind of gravelly, rocky substrate to spawn on. In some places where there's a dam, for example, they'll run up to the dam, and then there'll be some habitat in the tailwater that they can use. In some places with lakes that have rivers running into them, sometimes they'll actually run from the lake into the river. A lot of our Great Lakes populations do that. So those river fish are looking for the same types of habitats, and usually, at least in my experience, there is some sort of kind of upstream migration toward finding suitable spawning habitat. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's spot on, Zach. For our audience out there, walleye are naturally a river fish that have adapted to lakes. And so, in our inland lakes, they're generally seeking out those rocky cobble, gravel sorts of habitats that you might find in, upper ends of a river and certain places in a river where they would spawn. And so our rivers, like Zach said, they tend to move upstream if that habitat's available. But also, interestingly, there's places like the Lake Winnebago system where there's a lot of spawning on vegetation and in marshes. And so they've also adapted to other riverine conditions. I think there's some of this in like Lake Pepin of the Mississippi River as well, where walleye spawn there. So they have the ability to adapt in where they spawn and based on certain conditions. But in general, we typically look to nearshore areas that have rocky gravel cobble habitat and are generally windswept. Those keep those eggs oxygenated and down in the crevices of those substrates for protection. So they've got water temperatures heating up, they're protected from predators, and they've also got oxygen-rich waters being waved over them.
Right, because those eggs are going to sit, incubate for 5 to 10 days, depending on water temperature. In warmer temperatures, they'll hatch faster, and colder temperatures will take them longer. So you need those kind of areas that ideally will not get covered over and smother the eggs, for example, and kind of offer some protection from predators while those eggs are incubating. So like Greg said, the kind of classic spawning habitat that we think about is that kind of rocky cobble, kind of windswept area. and they'll absolutely use other habitats, but it's another thing to think about, going all the way back to that shoreline development question, in terms of thinking about kind of what habitats are available for walleye to use and how important that is as well, in addition to the phenology stuff for kind of them being able to reproduce and produce good year classes.
Okay, thanks. Another question about trout perch. Are they being introduced as forage?
Not to my knowledge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Question about the Wisconsin River. How would this translate to the Wisconsin River fisheries health, particularly in the driftless area? There's a different species ecology, but the temps, they assume, are also shifting in that system.
Yeah, it's an outstanding question too, and it was identified and has been identified as a high priority research need for Wisconsin, and one that I mentioned Steph Shaw before, one of our research scientists. She's starting to gather some data to look at some of these questions with our river spawning fish. I think what we do know from our surveys from the rivers is that the recruitment has tended to be more consistent and stable and good in the longer term here compared to some of the observations we're seeing in our inland lakes. And so, we don't know if it's just Mother Nature somewhat kicking back in an individual lake and saying conditions might have been good for walleye during a certain period of time, and then they're not so good right now and are favoring other species for inland lakes, or if it's something to do with habitat and the other things we're investigating. But I welcome Zach's thoughts here too, but we're starting to research some of these similar aspects on rivers, but to what we have available to us right now in places like the Wisconsin River and the lower Wisconsin is that, again, recruitment has tended to be, pretty consistent and good in the longer term in those systems. And again, it might be a factor of walleye being, a river fish. That's where they've evolved is with rivers.
Yeah, I think that's right. That, we seem to, our river populations seem to be doing better in general than our lakes populations. And why that is, as Greg said, is a question that we want to answer. The other consideration when we think about river fish is you have this extra wrinkle of flow, and how that can be used as a trigger for river spawning fish, is kind of telling them that flows are going up. Maybe it's time to migrate and start finding these areas, or flows come up and water levels come up, and maybe that makes habitat available for them to spawn on. So there's this extra consideration of how flow rates play into the phenology of fishes that spawn in rivers. And in addition, how flow and temperature and light and all the things we talked about before are kind of playing together, and whether that can cause different mismatches. So for example, if they are cued more by light and they spawn when flows aren't ideal, that can add some issues with recruitment. So that's another variable that we have to consider and think about. And it's when we're thinking about river fishes, and particularly walleye, and kind of what triggers them to spawn and what makes a good year class, it's something that we're going to be looking into hopefully in the near future. Yeah.
All right, we have another question about the size of 15, or the age of 15 to 18-inch walleyes, which you had mentioned before. Can you just quickly recap the age of fish in that range?
Yeah, I mean, we mentioned it varies, and Greg, you can overrule me here, but I think a fair guess would be maybe 3 to 5, depending on systems and how fast fish are growing in those lakes. We have some lakes that are kind of slow growing and they need to get pretty old, and some lakes that can produce a good sized fish in 3 years or so. But I think if you think 3 to 5, you'll be pretty close in a lot of cases for a 15-inch walleye.
Yep, I would agree.
Okay, then we just had a quick note. Somebody was looking up the trout perch and mentioned that they are in the Percopsidae family, closely related to the pirate perch, if anybody wants to check them out and learn more.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
That seems like something new to me, and there might be a new family now compared to our ichthyology days, Zach.
Yep, we're getting old and we're missing out on all the new taxa apparently. But yeah, that's cool. I'm glad somebody looked that up. Thanks.
All right, so that's going to conclude our session here. We now have a break before the morning plenary session with Wisconsin Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes and atmospheric scientist Catherine Hayhoe. Please use the next 15 minutes to have a stretch break, go outside and enjoy the sunshine for a few minutes, and take a few minutes to visit the exhibit booths and the conference platform. We'll see you back here at 12 o'clock for the next Climate and Fisheries presentation.